Micah Parsons on missed practices at today's minicamp. Defense is defense. I'm pretty much caught up. Paul Gunther was meeting with me, the run game coordinator. I feel like I was just getting better and getting stronger and getting faster about his offseason so far. He joked that he and DC Mike Zimmer haven't talked much, says he's a quiet person. All I keep hearing from the coaches is that Zim likes it this way, but I like it this way. I can't wait to have a true sit-down with him. I think it'll be pretty cool because obviously old school mindset, old school mentality. He's had a lot of great players, but he's never had a Micah before. It'll be fun, and I think it'll be unique. It's going to be a compromising relationship. He said CeeDee Lamb deserves $36 million a year and talked about there was a time Aaron Donald didn't even go to training camp and won Defensive Player of the Year. Says, I'm an undersized rusher who gets banged up every year, so I'm just letting my body heal. As Jane Slater, NFL Network, joins you now here on 105.3 The Fan. And a good evening, Jane. How the heck are you? We got you, Jane?
I'm here. Guys, it's been a minute. How are you?
It has been a minute. It's great to hear you. What was your reaction to Micah Parsons saying what he said today about his offseason so far?
That he's got sumo-sized, you know what? Let's be honest. I think a lot of these guys probably feel that way. It's rare that you see a player say these things with his chest. And to be clear, I think tone is important in a lot of these things. And that's why even when I tweeted this stuff out, I wanted to make sure it wasn't just 140 characters, right? I think it's easy for things to get out of context. You know, Micah will spend 30 minutes in his locker talking to us, and there isn't a filter, and I think a lot of us appreciate that. You know, we were covering these teams, you know, back in, you know, the 2000s, some people in the 90s. People weren't worried about being politically correct or saying, you know, what people wanted them to say, but it sure puts a target on his back sometimes. But, yeah, I mean, he was lighthearted about it. He was matter of fact, and there was a confidence about it. And so I think, again, that's the important aspect of this. I think the one thing that I did push back on is I said, you know, what if other guys start feeling this way? You know, Micah, when he was talking about the chemistry thing, and Calvin and I were kind of digging in here, but I said, you know, you talk about this chemistry thing, you could tell at the end of the year, and even talking to some of the players in the offseason, there was a bit of a disconnect. And while I agree with them that they are going to be in Oxnard for a long time and you're staying on property, and that's the spirit of training camp and why Jerry does it out in Oxnard, you know, I was listening to Brian earlier. You do have a new defensive coordinator coming in here, and you do have a new scheme. And, you know, you've talked to Eric Kendricks. I've talked to Eric Kendricks. Here's a person who's familiar with it. Even when I was talking to Brock Hoffman, the center today, he talked about how many different looks they were showing, how they were hiding and disguising. And so I think that's why it's important for him to be there. And, you know, his pushback when I brought it up about other players was he said, you know, some people get paid a whole lot of money to be here, and I'm not one of them. And he probably could have said less there. I didn't really have a problem with everything else that Micah said. Like, I get it. Like, I do believe that, you know, we've seen guys that have played through injury, and Brian, I heard you earlier, or maybe it was one of you guys talking about Sean Lee got injured, you know, during OTAs once. So that's all fair. And, you know, to Micah's credit, he did say, look, I've been up there from time to time in the hot tub, and I'm doing off-season stuff with the guys. I just think, you know, especially if you want to get paid that big contract, no matter how good a player you are, and there are different rules, Jimmy Johnson has talked about that in the past, I think it goes a long way to show up. And so I think that's kind of my only pushback to what Micah said today. But while I was sitting there listening to him, guys, I was like, man, this guy would have been a hell of a guy on a speech and debate team, because I thought he made some salient points about protecting your body, the fact that it is voluntary. I just think it's easy to question him a little bit given some of the comments he made about chemistry and wanting to be sort of the face of this franchise.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where I was a little bit rubbed the wrong way by this, Jane, is because he went out on his way on his podcast with CeeDee Lamb and talked about the culture and wanting to change that this offseason, and to not be there and then kind of brush it off like it doesn't really matter. I mean, I get the Remember the Titans comparison. Some of the stuff he said makes sense, but I don't know if maybe some of that stuff being so outspoken, but then maybe the actions not necessarily leading to what he said, is some of the stuff that we hear might rub people the wrong way.
Well, and particularly, like, you understand why CeeDee's holding out, right? Like, CeeDee is up and due. And, I mean, you can make a lot of arguments that, you know, CeeDee deserves to get paid. And I truly think CeeDee is going to get paid. I think it's going to be one of these things we're going to get to training camp, and it's going to be, we're going to have an announcement like we did with Trayvon Diggs, like we've done with DeMarcus. Well, DeMarcus Lawrence, I think, was in April. You know, we've seen other guys get done right before camp. I truly believe that one's going to happen. But, you know, Mike is still technically, 2 years away? And then with Dak, you know, Dak could have held out too, but Dak's there. Yeah. And so I think that's the other thing that's a little bit like, I don't know. And, you know, look, to be fair, he really hasn't been an OTAs guy. And to hear him explain it today, he said, you know, he typically doesn't hit the field until, you know, May, June, but maybe you can still show up and do walkthroughs with the guys and coach guys up, but not necessarily practice.
Jane, I have a theory that he doesn't like classroom football. And that's why
you say that earlier, Brian, and I agree with you on that.
Yeah. I don't think that
and here's why.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you know, when the season was over, excuse the dog, when the season was over, you know, I had some conversations with guys that were off the record, and I didn't really want to get into it because I've learned my lesson, but I know how these things can fester. And also after a season, I know that, you know, people are going to feel a type of way, right? Especially when, you know, you could argue that was probably one of the best teams they've rolled out there on the football field. They were active in free agency. And then for it to sort of end the way that it did. But, you know, one of the things I was told by one of the players and a coach was that Micah, you know, sometimes getting him to sit tight in the linebackers room was tough, that he would drift to, you know, the wide receivers room, or he'd sit down in the running backs room. And, you know, it was almost like that kid that says, I got to go to the bathroom. And then getting him to sit down in class is, you know, next to impossible. And one player said to me, and I thought this was interesting, they said, Micah could be an incredible linebacker because he's smart enough if he would just take the time to do the work. But the reason why he rushes more is because he's not willing to put in that time.
Exactly.
Because it's more of an instinctive role. So, again, that's one person's thought. You know, and another coach talking about him drifting. I think he's the type of guy, and there are people like this. They do better when, you know, it's the big game or it's game day. They get up for that. But I do believe that given some of the issues, I think last year, or some of the off season, some of the, you know, the locker room disconnect, I think this was probably maybe the year to sort of tap in it. And like I said, I appreciate that he wants to protect his body. I agree with them that all the equity you have is in your body. And one of the things that he did say, I thought was I spot on. I was like, I agree with you. He's like, if I'm not taking care of me and my body falls apart, they'll just go get another me. And that's true.
Yeah.
And so I get that. And, you know, he's like, again, these are voluntary. He today was there at mandatory camp. But there is some of the install. And Brian, I also heard you, I didn't see this in practice, but you know, you are kind of holding up practice a little bit, that when you show up, it's like, well, wait, man, you're not in the right gap, or we've got to, you know, walk you through this. And so I understand some of, so I guess my point in saying is I see both sides of it. Just sometimes with Micah, and this is never going to change. And I think this is what I've grown to appreciate with him. You know, we saw him with the tweets his freshman year about he got political, right? He's always going to say it with his chest. He's always going to be very convicted about what he has to say. And there's never really going to be a filter. And so, I mean, at least you always kind of know where you stand and what to expect from him.
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty that he has. I mean, I wish he'd be more honest about, like I say, if he just told me, I don't like the classroom stuff. I don't care. When I want to learn, I'll learn during the season. I'll prep during the season. I'll do what I have to do during the season. You know, I don't want to be in meetings in May. I don't want to be in meetings in April, you know?
Look, I'm not a big Mavs girl. I know that you guys are, you know, basketball, whatever. I mean, Luka, wasn't he getting crushed in the press because he wasn't showing up looking the right way? And then this guy has been absolutely dominant in the postseason. I think the only knock again on Micah, where he's hurting himself a little bit, is there has been criticism about his game not being as strong at the end of the season. And so there are still, you can kind of poke some holes a little bit in Micah still. And like, I think Micah I think he's a great player, and I think he can be even greater. And I appreciate some of the off-season work that he does to get better, and the way that he's reached out to a lot of veterans to do that. But I just think overall, some of this, it can sour a locker room. It can sour some of the coaches. And I think a lot of these guys think they're Teflon, but we've all seen this, right? It's very, very easy to get people to think to get a narrative about you and to move off that narrative.
Absolutely. Jane Slater with us. Is there any reason to believe the Cowboys will change course on as they view him as a piece of the future?
I think it remains to be seen, right? I think it's going to be very interesting, even him saying stuff he said about Zimmer Day. And again, context is everything. He was, kind of tongue in cheek about it, but saying, coaches tell me Zim likes to do one thing one way, I like to do it the other, and saying he's only had like 20 words with them. The first thing I would have done today was sought out Mike Zimmer. He is the guy that's going to decide whether, if you think about it, his relationship with Dan Quinn is the reason why Micah became Micah, because he went up to Dan and said, I can play edge for you, put me in all these different roles. And, I've always credited Dan Quinn for saying, yeah, let's give the rookie a shot, even though we drafted you as a linebacker. I think Zimmer, I reached out to another player. It's so funny. Everyone thinks it's, some player in the building still. It's not. I talked to one of Zim's players today, and I was chatting with him a little bit about some of this. And he said, people get an idea of Zim, and this is a quote, in their head that he isn't always well, hold on. People get an idea of Zim in their head that he isn't always accurate. He's an old school guy, but he's also smart and creative on how to get favorable matchups for a guy like Micah. Yeah. Once they actually work together, it won't really be a compromise. It won't be a compromise. I heard what you had to say. Look, I get that Jerry's going to say you got to play this guy. This is Micah Parsons, but I think Mike has enough skins in the building and enough time with Jerry that I do think Jerry's going to value his opinion. And so Mike is going to have to get on board. For me, I'd personally, if I've got a new boss, I'd want to get on board sooner rather than later.
Jane, where are we at with CeeDee Lamb? Are you hearing anything, agent scuttlebutt, anything like that going on?
Absolutely not. It's interesting. This has been, when you work for the network, they don't necessarily, I pitch, let's talk about the linebacking unit and let's talk about the running backs. They don't necessarily care about those things. But both sides really haven't talked, and I've been reaching out and trying to get information, really from both sides. So I was trying to take it like a different angle yesterday. And last week when I talked to someone, they said, $32 million is likely the jump off point. And that was after A.J. Brown and Amon St. Brown. Now you're looking at roughly 33, 34. But then I think the big piece of this pie is going to be that $110 million guaranteed. And, one of my questions too, and I talked to a couple agents yesterday, how do you get creative with 110? Like, let's say it's even somewhere around that when you've got this cap. And they were saying that you could do what they call a cap option bonus is what they call it. Basically, you lock in a number that's your guarantee, you turn it into an option bonus, and then you prorate that out to give you additional cap space. So just for illustration purposes, let's say that you're going to say that the number is $50 million. Obviously, it's going to be higher than that. And let's say his annual per year is $5 million. So the way it was explained to me, and I hope I'm not screwing this up, it shows you're $5 million, but technically you're going to prorate and turn that into a signing bonus fee. The $10 million, you'll spread it out over 5 years. So that's 10. So technically you're making 15 a year, but you're spreading out that essentially that guaranteed money. The player's getting paid and it's not counting against the cap. So it's a way to get creative. Now the problem I was explained, obviously if you cut the player, then that's dead money you've got to deal with. So I don't know if the Cowboys want to do that. The only problem here is, and I think, again, I still think this thing gets done, the Cowboys could say, well, your team doesn't want to come to the table. Like, keep in mind, this is both sides, right? Like, CeeDee Lamb's side's got to come to the table, but why would they come to the table before Jefferson? Why would they come to the table before A.J. Brown? Why would they come to the table before Ayuk or T. Higgins? They want to see what those numbers are and how they can play with them. The problem is the Cowboys could come to them and say, well, we're paying you next year $18 million, and then the next 2 years we can tag you. The problem with that for the Cowboys is then you got to take the top 5 averages of the APYs for the wide receivers. You average that, and that number could be at this point, 34 million next year or 35. So you're already having that counting a strip. That's not advantageous to the Cowboys. And then if they decided to do that, which I think would be crazy, then they've got to say, well, you've got to sign the tag. Well, then CD could say, well, I'm not going to sign it. Well, then you'd have to sit out a year. So everyone has a little bit of leverage here, but I think ultimately something's going to get done. It's a long way of saying this thing is actually a little bit more complicated than everybody thinks it is.
Jane, person who says Burger King fries are better than McDonald's fries, can they be trusted?
Ooh, here's what I'll say about that. That's a good one. I think McDonald's fries are dominant, but I like Burger King burgers. That charbroil just hit.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, your face, Chief.
And we can agree to disagree on that one, but it was a fries
grilled,
question. It was a
man.
fries
Jane
question.
absolutely
It was a fries question.
No,
You would like a Whopper if you
asked
had
the
one,
question.
Eric.
You asked. She gave you a
It's a
great
damn good
answer.
answer.
Great answer, Jane.
I love you guys. I've missed you.
Thanks for your insights, Jane, and we'll see you in Oxnard.
Looking forward to tackling you dummies on the beach. Let's do this.
Bring it on, Jane.